July 18, 1944, Point Kaido, Palau Islands. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of salt and impending rain, a suffocating shroud over the jungle-choked coastline of Point Kaido. Major Elias Thorne, his uniform sweat-soaked and clinging to his lean frame, scanned the topographical map, illuminated by a dim, flickering lantern. His knuckles, calloused from years of gripping rifles and binoculars, traced the contours of the Japanese defensive perimeter. Artillery bombardment, a symphony of destruction orchestrated by the battleships USS Pennsylvania and USS Maryland, had just ceased, leaving behind a ringing silence punctuated only by the distant, mournful cries of seabirds and the nervous hum of the jungle. Operation Stalemate the Sioux was underway, its objective to neutralize Japanese airfields and secure strategic anchorages in the Palau Group, a prelude to MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Thorne's unit, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had the grim honor of cracking Point Kaido, a jagged promontory bristling with coastal guns and machine gun nests carved deep into the coral rock. Intelligence estimated the garrison at 2,500 hardened Imperial Army troops. Casualties were expected to be severe. Thorne felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach, a cold counterpoint to the sweltering humidity. He'd seen too many good men fall in this unforgiving theater, where every inch of ground was paid for in blood. His orders were clear. Destroy the coastal batteries, secure the approaches to the main island, no matter the cost. Yet a nagging unease persisted, an almost imperceptible tremor beneath the surface of the mission brief, suggesting something darker than mere fortifications awaited them. The pre-dawn assault was a brutal ballet of flame and steel. Landing craft scraped ashore on coral shingle, disgorging waves of Marines into a hail of interlocking machine gun fire. The beachhead was a cauldron of chaos, the acrid smell of high explosives mixing with the stench of fear and scorched earth. Thorne watched from an observation post just inland, the battle unfolding through his field glasses, a silent movie of heroism and horror. He barked orders into the field telephone, his voice raspy from shouting over the din, directing fire support, pushing companies forward. The initial phase was critical. Failure to establish a secure foothold would mean annihilation on the exposed beaches. His battalion had been assigned the spearhead, the unforgiving task of breaching the outer defenses. The cost of a single M3 Stuart light tank, invaluable for suppressing pillboxes, was roughly $40,000 in 1944, equating to over $600,000 in today's dollars, and Thorne had already seen 2 of them reduced to twisted metal. Each loss was a punch to the gut, a tangible subtraction from their meager resources, a stark reminder of the relentless attrition of this war. The first ridge was taken after an hour of savage hand-to-hand combat, the Marines using flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear bunkers that resisted conventional fire. Thorne felt a fleeting surge of grim satisfaction. His men were holding, pushing forward, but the deeper they probed into Kaido's labyrinthine defenses, the more unsettling the intelligence became. Reconnaissance reports, pieced together from aerial photographs and limited patrols, indicated an unusual concentration of non-combatant personnel within the Japanese-held areas, specifically around an old, disused phosphate mining facility deep within the promontory. It wasn't a typical garrison setup. The numbers didn't add up for purely military functions. Thorne dismissed it as an anomaly, another peculiarity of Japanese defensive doctrine. But the unease lingered, a faint echo of a distant drumbeat. He pushed it aside. The immediate objective was the coastal guns. Private First Class Samuel "Sam" Kincaid, clutching his M1 Garand, scrambled over the lip of a crater, the sudden silence after a near-miss artillery shell ringing in his ears. His mouth was dry, coated with the fine dust of pulverized coral and cordite. The air vibrated with the distant thud of naval guns and the closer, sharper crack of rifle fire. He tasted blood from a split lip, the result of being thrown against a rock during the last Japanese counterattack. Sam, just 19, had the haunted eyes of a veteran, his innocence long since burned away in the inferno of Tarawa and Saipan. His company, Easy Company, was tasked with clearing the central spine of Point Kaido, a series of fortified tunnels and caves that formed the backbone of the Japanese defense. Each tunnel entrance was a death trap, each cave a potential tomb. The stench of human waste, decay, and stagnant water permeated the air within the humid, oppressive darkness of the underground passages. He could feel the vibrations of distant explosions through the rock beneath his boots, a constant, unsettling tremor. They moved methodically, grimly, flushing out pockets of resistance with grenades and phosphorus. "Watch your flanks, Kincaid," hissed Sergeant Miller, his voice barely audible above the clatter of a distant bar. Sam nodded, his eyes darting into the shadows, his finger hovering near the trigger guard. His M1, a marvel of American engineering, felt like an extension of his own arm, its 8-round clip a lifeline. The technical simplicity of its gas-operated action belied its devastating effectiveness. As they penetrated deeper, the nature of the Japanese defenses shifted. The familiar fanatical charges and banzai attacks gave way to a more disciplined, almost strategic withdrawal, luring them further into the maze. They encountered fewer snipers, but more booby traps, tripwires connected to grenades, camouflaged pits with sharpened bamboo stakes. The Japanese, it seemed, were buying time. For what? Sam wondered. The objective was the main gun emplacements, 3 massive 150mm Type 41 coastal defense guns, capable of shelling ships 20 kilometers offshore. Destroying these was paramount. But as they pressed on, following a particularly narrow, winding tunnel, a strange, sickly sweet odor began to permeate the dank air. It wasn't the smell of gunpowder or decaying flesh, but something chemical, acrid, vaguely almond-like, unsettlingly familiar from gas mask training but never truly encountered in the field. His stomach churned. "Anyone else smell that?" he whispered to the man next to him, Private Rodriguez. Rodriguez, a seasoned veteran of Guadalcanal, simply shook his head, his face a mask of grim determination. He was focused on the next turn, his bar held ready. Sam's senses, however, were on high alert. The smell grew stronger as they approached a steel-reinforced door, heavily guarded, unlike any other they had encountered. It was sealed with heavy bolts, not typical for a mere ammunition dump or personnel bunker. This felt different. What remained unknown was that deep within the heart of Point Kaido, beyond the layers of hardened concrete and coral rock, General Toshiro Kuroda, the sector commander, had enacted a desperate contingency. Faced with inevitable defeat and unwilling to suffer the ignominy of surrender, Kuroda had planned a final, horrifying act. His intention was not merely to execute his remaining prisoners of war, but to unleash a modified sulfur mustard agent, a potent vesicant, on the advancing American lines, using the captured personnel, American, British, and Australian, as initial vectors. These prisoners had been forced to labor in the old phosphate mine, unwittingly processing crude forms of chemicals under the guise of mining operations, contaminating themselves and serving as a ghastly test population. The plan was chillingly simple. Just before the final American breach, the chemical agent, loaded into repurposed artillery shells and crude dispersal devices, would be set to detonate around the prisoner-holding areas, dispersing the gas and contaminating the escape routes. The subsequent American advance through the contaminated zone, believing it to be merely a conventional battleground, would suffer catastrophic casualties, their gas masks useless against the insidious absorption through skin and eyes. Kuroda believed this final horrific act would inflict a psychological blow so profound it might momentarily halt the American juggernaut, buying him a few hours of defiant resistance before his inevitable demise. The heavy door was finally breached by a concentrated charge, blowing it off its hinges with a deafening roar. Inside, a cavern opened up, not to a typical military installation, but to a scene of abject misery and chilling purpose. Dr. Eleanor Vance, her once pristine white medical uniform now a tattered, stained shroud, recoiled from the blast, shielding the frail figure of a young Australian corporal beside her. Her eyes, sunken and ringed with fatigue, took in the sudden blinding light from the tunnel entrance. For months, since her capture during the fall of Singapore and subsequent transfer through a brutal chain of camps, she had endured the living hell of Japanese captivity. Here, In the belly of Point Cato, the conditions had been worse than anywhere else. The air was heavy with the same sickeningly sweet, acrid odor that Sam Kincaid had smelled, but Eleanor knew it intimately. It was a faint yet pervasive scent of hydrogen cyanide and chloropicrin, chemicals she knew from her pre-war studies as a biochemist, mixed with the musky tang of raw phosphate rock. She and the other prisoners, a motley collection of Allied soldiers, sailors, and civilian engineers, had been forced to extract minerals from the old mine shafts, a labor that had grown increasingly strange and arduous. They had been working with unfamiliar substances, mixing compounds in giant vats under the watchful eyes of Japanese chemists, not ordinary guards. The guards' demeanor had become increasingly agitated, even terrified, in the past few days, a subtle shift that Eleanor, with her acute observational skills, had noted with growing dread. Eleanor had tried to piece together the fragments of overheard conversations, the cryptic orders, the unusual equipment being brought in. She had seen the makeshift artillery shells, their casings distinctively marked, stored in a separate, heavily guarded chamber. The Japanese chemists, unlike the regular guards, showed no respect for the Emperor's soldiers, treating them as expendable tools, often berating them for being too slow or inefficient in their mixing duties. Eleanor herself, a civilian, had been an anomaly from the start, her medical skills briefly utilized before being put to work in the mines. Her hands, once precise surgical instruments, were now raw and calloused from wielding a pickaxe. The hunger was a constant gnawing pain in her stomach. A daily ration of watery rice and occasionally fish, barely enough to sustain life, left them perpetually weak. Diseases, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, swept through the camp unchecked. Of the original 200 prisoners brought to Cairo 6 months prior, only 112 remained alive. She'd watched men die, their bodies racked with fever, their minds broken by the unending brutality. She'd tried to offer what comfort she could, but hope was a scarce commodity here. The Japanese soldiers, under the command of a particularly sadistic Captain Sato, seemed to delight in their torment, meting out beatings for the slightest infraction. Eleanor remembered Captain Sato once saying, in broken English, "You are no longer men. You are merely tools for the Emperor." His words had haunted her. Just hours before, the guards had begun moving the prisoners into smaller, cramped cells adjacent to where the modified shells were stored. Panic had begun to ripple through the emaciated ranks. There was a palpable sense of finality in the air, a chilling certainty that their time was running out. She heard the distant roar of naval gunfire, then the closer, sharper crackle of rifle fire. Hope, a dangerous and fleeting emotion, had flared within her, only to be immediately extinguished by the renewed conviction that this was merely the prelude to their end. The Japanese would never allow them to be rescued. They would be eliminated first, a final spiteful act. As the charge exploded and the American Marines burst through, bathed in the dust and smoke, Eleanor's first thought was not of rescue, but of the chemical shells, now exposed, and the terrible knowledge of their contents. A quick glance confirmed her fears. The hastily rigged detonators, connected to a complex array of timers and pressure plates, were clearly visible. The final act of Kuroda's desperate plan was seconds away from being triggered. Her voice, hoarse from disuse, tore through the chaos. "Gas! They're releasing gas! Don't let them detonate the shells!" Her warning, shrill and desperate, cut through the din of gunfire and shouted orders. The American Marines, momentarily stunned by the sight of the emaciated prisoners, hesitated. Sam Kincaid, the first man through the breached door, found himself staring into a scene that would forever scar his memory. Emaciated figures draped in rags blinked in the sudden light. The pungent chemical odor was overwhelming now, confirming his earlier suspicions. His eyes quickly swept the cavern, taking in the makeshift cells, the stacks of unusual shells, and the frantic Japanese soldiers scrambling to activate what looked like demolition charges. He saw the woman, her face streaked with dirt and tears, pointing frantically at the shells. Gas. Her warning, raw with terror, was unambiguous. His training kicked in. Chemical attack. He immediately understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a prison. It was a trap. a weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at his comrades. He yelled, "Gas! Gas! Flamethrowers! Explosives on the shells!" The Marines behind him, their faces grim, reacted instantly. The flamethrower team, still reeling from breaching the door, pivoted, their nozzles roaring to life, sending streams of liquid fire towards the Japanese attempting to arm the charges. The technical details of disabling chemical ordnance were beyond Sam's immediate knowledge, but destruction was a universal solvent in combat. The primary objective shifted in an instant from rescue to neutralization. Major Thorne, receiving Kincaid's frantic radio report. "Sir, we've got POWs, but they're rigging chemical shells. Repeat, chemical shells. Need demolitions and medics now." Felt a cold wave of horror wash over him. The nagging unease had finally found its terrifying explanation. The unusual activity, the strange smells, the abnormal troop movements, it all clicked into place. This was a war crime of unprecedented savagery. He barked new orders into his radio, his voice strained but firm. "Pull back easy, company, from direct engagement, suppress enemy movement and secure the perimeter. First reconnaissance, divert and establish a blocking position. Captain Davies, get your engineers and demolitions experts forward. Code Red, chemical threat. Priority 1 is neutralizing those munitions. Second priority is extraction of POWs." The entire tactical plan for the capture of Point Kaido shifted in a matter of minutes. The coastal guns, once the primary objective, became secondary to preventing an atrocity. Thorne understood the strategic implications immediately. If the Japanese successfully deployed such a weapon, even on a small scale, it could trigger a terrifying escalation, a grim tit-for-tat that would plunge the Pacific into an even darker abyss. The cost of a single major chemical attack, in terms of human lives and retaliatory actions, was immeasurable. The immediate decision was clear: risk everything to prevent it. He dispatched runners, ensuring every unit understood the new, urgent directive. The fight inside the cavern was a blur of violence and desperate action. The flamethrower team, led by Corporal Jenkins, poured fire onto the Japanese engineers, incinerating them before they could trigger the main detonator. Sergeant Miller, with grim efficiency, used a captured Japanese light machine gun to suppress any remaining resistance, his face streaked with powder and sweat. Sam Kincaid, despite the choking chemical odor, helped guide the terrified prisoners away from the shells, pushing them towards the relative safety of the tunnel entrance. He saw Eleanor Vance, despite her emaciated state, trying to calm the other prisoners, her voice thin but resolute. "Move! Quickly! Don't touch anything!" Demolitions experts, led by Lieutenant Riley, arrived, their faces grim, their satchels heavy with C4. Riley, a young but experienced engineer, immediately assessed the situation. The shells were crude but effective, filled with a mixture designed to aerosolize upon detonation. He and his team worked with frantic precision, cutting wires, diffusing fuses, their hands steady despite the extreme pressure. Each deactivated shell was a victory, a life saved. The air remained thick with the chemical odor, a constant reminder of the near disaster. The strategic turning point had been swift and decisive. The discovery of the chemical plan, the urgent retasking of the Marines, and the rapid neutralization of the threat had not only saved the lives of 112 prisoners, but had also averted a potential chemical warfare nightmare in the Pacific. It was a surgical intervention in the heart of an atrocity. The firefight raged for another hour, a desperate final stand by the remaining Japanese forces. General Kuroda, realizing his plan had been foiled, ordered a suicidal charge, but it was easily repelled by the now alerted Marines. The coastal guns were ultimately silenced, but the true victory that day was not in the destruction of artillery, but in the prevention of a far greater horror. The 112 prisoners, barely alive but profoundly grateful, were eventually evacuated, their stories a chilling testament to the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. The operation was costly. During the initial assault and the subsequent raid to neutralize the chemical threat, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, suffered 27 killed in action and 54 wounded. A total of 197 Japanese soldiers were killed in the immediate vicinity of the chemical storage, their desperate last stand against the American advance. The cost of such an operation, beyond the human toll, was substantial. The logistical effort alone, in terms of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies, for the assault on Point Kaido and the subsequent rescue, amounted to approximately $2.5 million in 1944 currency, which translates to roughly $38 million in current dollars. This did not even account for the ongoing costs of supporting the larger Palau campaign. Before the intervention and neutralization of the chemical threat at Point Kaido, intelligence reports indicated a growing Japanese morale, fueled by the belief in their divine wind and a willingness to utilize any means necessary, including chemical warfare, to halt the Allied advance, resulting in an estimated 15% increase in projected Allied casualties for subsequent island campaigns. After the successful prevention of the chemical attack and the rescue of the prisoners, Japanese operational reports noted a measurable psychological impact on their forces, particularly among those directly aware of Kuroda's failed plan, leading to an observed 20% faster collapse of similar island strongholds in the weeks that followed, as the prospect of such extreme measures failed to materialize or generate their intended terror. The memory of Point Kaido would forever be etched into the minds of those who fought there. Major Thorne, promoted to lieutenant colonel, carried the weight of those decisions, the knowledge that a split-second choice had prevented a humanitarian catastrophe. Sam Kincaid, awarded a Silver Star for his bravery, found solace in the faces of the survivors, knowing his actions had directly saved them. Eleanor Vance, repatriated and slowly recovering, dedicated her life to documenting war crimes, ensuring that such atrocities would never be forgotten. The precise and empathetic approach by the Marines, coupled with their unwavering determination, had prevented a horrific escalation. The inherent dignity of every human life, even in the crucible of war, demands fierce protection. True victory lies not just in conquest, but in preserving the very humanity one fights to uphold. The shadows cast by Kaido Point served as a stark reminder that even amidst total war, some lines must never be crossed.